Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Facebook Friday, because it's Friday and we're on Facebook again. And I'm Kate Wakelin from Neuroendocrine Cancer Australia, and you can see another face with me. So I'd just like to welcome Professor Tim Price to the space. So just before we begin, I just wanted to acknowledge that I am beaming to you from Wurundjeri land, and that's the land of the Kulin Nation, and would like to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I always say this because I love it so much, as I drop my phone, and that is that I love to run along the Yarra River, and in language that's called the Birrawong. So I'm deeply grateful for where I live. Just before I know that you're really keen to hear from Tim, so I'm not going to take up too much time with a COVID-19 update, but just to acknowledge that if you're in Melbourne, you're locked down with me, and just wanted to acknowledge we've got some Tasmanian patients who normally attend Peter Mac for their treatment. So I know that's been quite tricky for several of you. So if you're having difficulty navigating any aspect of your care related to COVID-19, then don't forget that you're welcome to get in touch with me, and I can perhaps help navigate through that. The other thing just to say was that there was some much more clear information come through this week from the Cancer Council about masks, and from the medical officer, chief medical officer in Victoria, particularly in Melbourne, to say that if you're part of the general public, even wearing masks out in public is now recommended. So it wasn't a very strong kind of directive, but it was talked about in the media conference yesterday. So I think if we can say if you're affected by cancer and you're in Melbourne, then please don't go shopping without wearing a mask. And the details about the attributes and how to care for masks and wear them safely is all on the information that I posted in the Facebook group this week. So the other thing I just wanted to mention was that there was some information about returning to work that I also posted in the Facebook group this week. So if you're employed as a net patient and you're concerned about COVID-19 and getting back into the workspace, then that's possibly going to be a really useful fact sheet to have a look at. So without further ado, welcome Professor Tim Price, who's joining us from Adelaide today. And Tim's actually stepped out of a meeting to join us briefly to talk to us a bit about some of the clinical trials that are happening in the NET space, both here and I think also internationally. So we're so grateful to you, Tim. I'm just wondering if we could please start by it's going back to Clinical Trials 101, and if you could possibly please just tell me about the phases. We hear in the media phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials. Could you tell us what they are and what the difference is between those, please?
Yeah, and that's particularly relevant if we talk about the Rose Bengal study a bit later, but which I've been involved in, as you know. But so for I guess the phases really relate to the way drugs are developed, and I guess the other aspect of it, particularly when you read the papers and so forth, is also what are called preclinical studies as well. So sometimes something will have a nice headline and it'll actually be in mice or even cells grown on a test, on a plate. So drugs go through that process, and then they come to humans, and the first investigation is essentially what's termed a phase 1 study. So they can be first in humans, so they're studies where a drug has not been used in a patient before, so you're really testing what it does to a person. And then there are phase 1 studies where an agent or drug might be used in a different indication where the effects or side effects might be different, and that's where the Rose Bengal study, for example, is. So it's really investigating how a treatment, usually a drug, is tolerated. So it's more around side effects and making sure there's no harm with a treatment, and often they won't necessarily be for a specific type of cancer or tumour. So it'll be very, very broad. Then once you've shown an agent is tolerated and the dose that's tolerated, which is the phase 1 part, you would then go to explore that drug or treatment in a particular type of tumour. And so that might be neuroendocrine tumour specifically, and then you would use that treatment in a larger group of patients to explore how effective it is, how much impact it has on the tumour in terms of growth control. Also getting more information around the side effects and how larger patient group tolerate the drug. And then what's called a phase 3 study, which is really the type of study that then changes the way we practice. So you've shown a new treatment, you've shown what dose to give, you've shown that it works in enough people to be thought to be useful to perhaps use routinely, and then you compare it to what is the normal treatment. So that might be drug A versus the new drug, which has come through the 1-2 process, and then you're randomized. So it's a computer allocation, or we and the patient unfortunately have, well, it's the way the trials are designed, but we don't have a choice. And so you're allocated to the current best treatment versus one that might be better. And the key thing with those studies is that we don't, by definition, know that the new treatment is better. So we're really trying to prove that. And that's what's a phase 3 study. And that then should, if the new treatment is better, lead to, I guess, what we call the PBS in Australia, in terms of then the drug being subsidised or provided by the government. And usually governments will require phase 3 randomly allocated type of trials before a treatment comes onto the PBS. Now, just briefly though, with some drugs, and we've seen this with some of the immunotherapy drugs in other tumours, because the signal is so strong in those phase 2 studies, so you see so much of a response, it can sometimes be obvious that those drugs are better, and that might be what's called fast-tracked to PBS, for example. So sometimes we do see very strong signals, yeah. But that's sort of how a drug, goes through the system to then be accessed. So really, certainly in the media, it might be test tube, or it might be phase 3 studies, yeah.
Thank you, Tim. That was a really great explanation. And you mentioned the Rose Bengal study just now, and I know certainly in our patient community, that's what we hear Professor Tim Price related to, and I know that we've got a lot of people who are really keen to hear about that study. Knowing that you talked at our Adelaide Forum last year, and a lot of people have seen that video, but maybe it would be great if you could talk about the Rose Bengal study in relation to the phases and what you know so far and what the next steps might be for that.
So so the Rose Bengal is, as I sort of mentioned before, an example of a phase 1 study. So as you say, some people have heard this before. I mean, Rose Bengal is actually a dye, historically an old dye used for various things, but sometimes for eye injuries. But it's been shown to have a treatment effect in melanoma, which is a tumour that's very sensitive to immunotherapy. And so the theory is that the Rose Bengal stimulates an immune response. So in melanoma, you would inject it into a lump, and then other lumps might then respond as well. And that's thought to be an immune response, turning on the immune system to fight. So in neuroendocrine tumours, the injection site is the liver, and that's what this trial is. And so I guess because it's a new way of delivering the drug and also a different tumour, the aim is to look at the tolerance. So primarily to make sure that the injection into the liver is tolerable, and then also explore what the effect is. So looking at the other tumours outside of the one that's injected to see if that immune response occurs. So the study has been running for a little while, but is almost finished. There is we're just needing one more patient actually to finish the phase 1, and that would be nice to then report the tolerance or the safety, and certainly it seems to be a very safe treatment. We've really only had one patient who had some issues, but probably coincidental, we think, unfortunately, that they would have probably happened at the same time, but that's always something for us to keep in mind. But for the other patients, it's been really very well tolerated, and we've seen some definite signal, which is important. So there does potentially seem to be this immune response. So what we would do, going back to your phases now, is we might then go to a phase 2 study in the future with a larger group of patients. And what we're hoping to do is to see if we can combine it with one of those current immune therapy drugs to see if we can boost the immune effect. So basically a immunotherapy drug and the Rose Bengal injection in a larger group of patients to get a better idea of how effective it is. So we found that it's safe, and then we're looking to do that phase 2 study. And I guess the point I made before, and that was again relevant, is that sometimes the signal you might get in a phase 2 study might be enough to tell us that this actually is something we should continue to do even without a phase 3 study, which as those who might be on know, might be difficult in neuroendocrine tumours because it's a fairly uncommon or rare tumour.
Okay, oh, that's really interesting, Tim. Can I ask you, you were talking about combining it with another immunotherapy drug in a phase 2. What's the thinking behind putting it with something else?
So, well, the theory of the drug is that it might improve or induce the immune system. So that's the theory of Rose Bengal, that it induces the immune system. And certainly even in other tumour types, melanoma being a good example, we know that if you actually combine 2 immune type treatments, you get a better effect. So we're seeing some improvement with the single Rose Bengal, but if we add it with another immune therapy, we may see an even better response. So the aim is to get a better outcome. Yeah.
And Tim, I know that you can't see into the future and see what this phase 2 trial might tell us, but I know, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but with the immunotherapy trials that have been done in neuroendocrine tumours, it seems that the higher grade tumours seem to be the ones that might be more susceptible to those immunotherapies. And yeah, as I said, correct me if I'm wrong about that. But does this coupling of the 2 products have any hope from you about perhaps being more broadly effective, or is it too soon to know that?
Well, I think the honest answer is it's a bit too soon to know, but yes, the aim or the hope, as you say, is that it will be more effective broadly. I think you asked about the higher grade tumours and whether immunotherapy works there. Is that? Yeah. So, I mean, certainly when you get to the higher grades, which also are similar to some of the other types of, for example, a type of lung cancer, for example, there is certainly some crossover there, and there's more of a signal for immunotherapy. I think that might be what you were touching on. So there is some information there. And again, combinations in that type, in that higher grade type, may also in the future be, and are currently being investigated in other studies. Yeah.
Oh, okay, well, look, thank you. That's really fascinating. Tim, I know there's another study that recently completed and that was published and presented, or at least it was presented at the ASCO conference. And I actually know a lot of our patients participated in this study as study subjects who received the treatment. That was the Control Nets trial. I'm wondering if you could tell us a dumbed down lay version, you know, something that I will understand, and then maybe the patients will be able to understand what were the findings of that.
So, I mean, as you say, a lot of people may well have been involved or know the study, but that was based on, you know, what's called lutate therapy, radiopeptide therapy, or lutate, as a lot of patients would know of it, and then combining that with chemotherapy. and the outcome was really at this stage, because I mean the key outcome was that the treatments themselves seemed to be generally very effective. I mean the results for all patients were actually very good. So I guess that tells us that, you know, we're getting a lot of control and you know, long-term control with those two therapies. The early signals are that there's probably fairly similar outcomes at the moment, whether you have the lutate on its own or with chemotherapy. Some signals that maybe you get better reduced tumour size with the chemotherapy in addition. But also with that though, some increase then in the side effects. So there's a little bit of a trade-off. The main signal is that with those treatments and the availability of the treatments though, we're seeing very, very good outcomes. Like, I think that's the key signal. And there will be some subtle differences that we might need some more time to be able to tease out whether the chemotherapy has an additional benefit beyond just that shrinkage, the ability to get shrinkage. Now, obviously, if you've got symptoms because of the size of some of the spots, lesions, then that response may be very important. So I guess it tells us that for some patients, we might want to give both because we want to get that really good shrinkage. But for some, it may not be necessary.
Okay, oh, that's really fantastic and helpful explanation. I guess in our Facebook book group, there's people from all over Australia and having treatment under all different oncologists, and so there's a lot of comparing of notes. And so I know there's conversations around some people going, well, I'm on CAPTEM as well as my PRRT, and other people are like, oh, I'm not on CAPTEM. Does that mean my doctor's wrong? But it sounds like what you're telling me is that it's more customised.
Yeah, so I think it tells us that customised, exactly. So it's more patient specific. So if there are certain symptoms that you might want to get under control quicker, you might use both, and then probably pull back a little bit. But I mean, the lutate is a defined treatment anyway, as we know, that 8 months of therapy for the first lot anyway. Whereas someone maybe with different symptoms might not need the chemotherapy. There's also a bit of difference in terms of other tests as well. So for those that have had the lutate, or for others obviously as well, if of interest, when you look at things like blood counts, previous treatments. So we are careful about kidney function, but also bone marrow function, the blood counts when we think about whether to use one or both therapies. So we might think that some people are going to be a bit more sensitive to their bone marrow, might be a bit more sensitive. So adding the chemotherapy might increase those problems with blood counts. So we might be better just focusing on the lutate. So yes, it comes down to a few different factors, but individualised, I guess, is, as you say, the key message. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Tim, I'm wondering if there's anything in the pipeline that's new that we might not have heard of, or that, you know, what are they talking about? And I know all of the conferences have gone virtual this year, but you know, what's in the pipeline for NETS in terms of upcoming research?
Well, I think we touched on a little bit before about the further exploring of immunotherapy. I think that's going to be something of the future. So looking at combinations and subgroups where it works best, and like all tumours, also looking at whether there are ways of trying to make the tumour sensitive to immunotherapy. So that's a big part of a lot of research at the moment. So trying to use some sort of manoeuvre or drug that makes the cells sensitive to immune therapy. So those combinations. So that'll be very much part of it. There's obviously ongoing research around the lutate in terms of, again, different combinations. I think we know that lutate is a very effective treatment. So the next step is really, how do we make that better? one of the studies that we're involved in which has come out of the Peter MacCallum is also looking at how we monitor patients. So at the moment, of course, we use a complex combination of, CT scan, gallium, PET scan, FDG or sugar-based PET scan. So I'm sure anyone who's watching has experienced the various scans we need to do. But one of the other ways we can sometimes monitor is to look at I guess sort of the tumour cells, or at least what we look at is the DNA of the tumour, which we can start to measure nowadays in the blood. So basically a blood test to look at whether we can measure the tumour cells and whether they're active or not, and whether they've changed or not. Various things we can look at anyway. It's very early and investigational, and certainly not a test we would be doing routinely at the moment. But there's this study coming out of Professor Michael's unit at Peter MacCallum, looking at the circulating tumour DNA and whether we can use that to monitor patients in a different way to all of the scans. So I guess how we monitor patients is also a big part of current investigation. And then, there are other studies. I think we did something like this a little while back at ENETS. There was a new what we call small molecule or molecular tablet-based drug that was being investigated. The larger studies for that drug and others similar are ongoing. So there are a number of studies. I guess the message is a number of studies across the broad spectrum of treatments for neuroendocrine tumours ongoing. Yeah. And then importantly, there's a lot of research going on, of course, around quality of life and symptom control. We know the telotrostat, or I can never remember the drug name for it, but that was an additional.
Zemello.
Yes, that's it. Yeah, Zemello.
It sounds like Zemello sounds like a lolly.
Yeah, it just doesn't sound. But so that of course is out there as well in terms of another way of controlling symptoms. So there's the quality of life and symptom control studies that are ongoing as well. So there's lots of research out there. In terms of new things, it's, I guess, mainly the immunotherapy at the moment, I think, is really one of the key focuses. Yeah.
So Tim, we've got a list of clinical trials that are currently in operation on our website. But if someone was out there in Timbuktu and looking at that list and going, oh, will that be useful for my situation? I'm always saying to people, talk with your own oncologist. Have you got any advice to add to that?
Well, I think initially, talk to your oncologist is the key thing, and never be concerned about raising information that you've obtained. I think that's very important, because sometimes, as much as we try to keep up with every study that's ongoing, particularly some of the, so again, going back to how we started, if you talk about phase 1 studies, for example, they are quite broad, and they may not be always on the radar of neuroendocrine tumour teams, because they're not necessarily specifically for neuroendocrine tumours. So they're a good example of, if you've found some information about a phase 1 study, raising that with your oncologist and seeing if or your oncology team as to whether that might be relevant is an important and good question, and certainly one that we would always be wanting to then explore for you. There are various other websites. Most of the states have the Cancer Council websites, which often have links to other clinical trials.
And people travel, sorry to interrupt him, but I don't know, you don't want to hear from anyone from Victoria at the moment, but do people travel interstate for clinical trials?
Oh, definitely. So certainly seeking studies even beyond your own state is not is very reasonable. It always comes down to what the logistics, what you're able to do. And so certainly patients, I've had patients who have explored trials at Peter MacCallum that may not be available in South Australia. I know we've had patients explore the Rose Bengal study with us from interstate as well. And it is certainly possible to then try to work out a flow, a pathway where that may work. It often does require a bit of travel, because remembering the key thing about trials is that you do unfortunately have to do that trial where the trial is open. So that's because of the ethics and the governance that guide the way we do trials. So you have to do it at that centre. So you would have to travel. You couldn't do it from home. But yeah, I mean, I think it does come down to what an individual can do, but it's certainly doable. Yeah.
And sorry too, I know we've just got a couple of minutes and a couple of questions in the waiting in the chat box, which is fantastic. But is there funding for things like, I know if you have to travel a long distance for treatment, you get some funding, some reimbursement for that travel. But how does the funding work for people who are having treatment via clinical trials?
Yeah, so I guess it gets a little bit more complicated, because if there is I guess I'm talking more now from the South Australian system, but I guess in theory, if there is a treatment available locally, I don't think our scheme would then reimburse travel elsewhere. So that would be something that would need to be sort of discussed and negotiated. But some studies nowadays do actually build in travel for patients to even go interstate. So there was a trial recently that I was aware of for a different type of tumour, GIST tumours, and that was paying for patients to go to Melbourne where the study was. So it's always worth asking the question, because some studies do sometimes build in a travel budget. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you for clarifying that, Tim. There's, I know you have to run back to your meeting in just a second. There were two questions, and you may decide that we provide a written answer afterwards if we've got time. Haven't got time today. The first question was, apparently crocodiles don't get cancer. Is there any reason? Is there any research into why they don't get cancer? And the other question was around the percentage of people from the control net study that progressed to myelodysplastic syndromes. So that's a complicated question, but
no, the second one is a bit easier and does reflect the fact that it's fairly early. So currently I don't believe we have any patients currently that have that myelodysplasia. I mean, I could be wrong, but but it does reflect that it's early. So myelodysplasia does tend to come a little bit later after subsequent therapy. So we did have some blood toxicity, some reduction in blood counts, but the point, I guess, the reason for the question is there is a known rate of that complication usually from a cumulative dosing, I guess, which is part of that balance and discussion. But that will come with future results, I guess, in terms of those numbers. So that's that question. In terms of the crocodile one, I'd have to take that on notice, actually, because I think I did know that fact, but I'm not sure I've ever known why, or if we actually do know why, because they certainly can live for a fair while. So it's not as if they're an animal that's sort of young. So they do have old crocodiles. So you would think they would be at risk. But I can take that on notice and see if I can find something out.
We will give that to you as homework, Tim. Thank you so much for that. Yes. And I know you have to run back to your meeting. So I'll let you click the red button to finish up. But before you do, just our thanks from everybody in our community. We've been getting, around 500 people view these videos each week. So we know that the information's really appreciated from people all around the place who may not have an opportunity to see you face to face, but at least be able to hear a conversation with you and ask some of their questions. So
yes.
Thank you once again.
No problem. And yes. Okay, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Great. So Jim's going to press the red button, and I've got a couple of things that I just wanted to finish off to tell you about. And thanks for your questions in the chat box. I'm feeling a little bit excited because it's the second week in a row that Facebook Friday has not broken. So just allow me a moment of, okay. Next week on Friday, I don't know, we're having, I think July must be guest expert Friday, guest expert July for Facebook Friday. We've got an oncologist from the Shoalhaven region called Lorraine Chantrell. So Lorraine is going to talk with us next week. And I think it's going to be really interesting having two medical oncologists in rapid succession, and Lorraine will be talking to us a bit more about clinical trials, but there may be other questions that we can talk about. We might quiz her on the crocodile question and see if she's got some extra knowledge about that she'd like to share. The other thing I was just going to say to you is just a reminder about the Getting Results study, and thank you so much to everybody who has participated in telling us your experiences with getting scans, and particularly your experiences around the gap between the scans and then the getting of the results. Next week, also after our Facebook Friday, we're having our online Zoom group meeting. So that's our monthly meeting that we alternate between afternoons and evenings. Our last one was a really fabulous gathering with mostly people from the country, which is what we kind of thought that might happen, because a lot of people who are attached with the metropolitan groups they are Zooming with their groups, which is great. But for those of you who, particularly if you're not attached to a group currently, if you're in the country, then that's listed as an event in our Facebook group page. So you're welcome to have a look at that. The other thing I would just mention, just a little reminder, it came up this morning in the Facebook conversations. We do have a carers group. Now, sometimes people who are patients click on that group, and sometimes it's just, you don't know where your mouse is clicking and it sort of happened before you've even realised it. But for people who are carers, so it's a private space just for carers, and I just wanted to make sure that you knew about that, because we know that for carers the issues are really different. You're not the one who's experiencing all the physical symptoms and the treatments and things, but there's still so much to be dealing with and managing, and so that's a place, I guess, for people to be able to share that experience and support each other through that experience. So just encourage you, if you are a carer and you don't know about that, I will put a link in the notes to that. So without further ado, thank you everybody for joining me today. And look, I hope that you stay safe, and particularly, I'm just thinking about our Melbourne and our Victorian unicorns who just are hunkering down and getting your masks organised. And yeah, don't hesitate to get in touch with me if there's anything that we can do to support you through that. So take care, everybody. I will look forward to seeing you next Friday.